So please welcome Dr. Gordon Müller-Seitz for his presentation. Gordon is the chair of the Strategic Management Department of Business Studies and Economics at the Technical University of Kaiserslautern in Germany. He has research and consulting interests, and particularly interested in dealing with risks and uncertainties in disease outbreaks and collaborating and coordinating emergency networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Steve, and also for the invitation by the Robert Koch Institute and the ECDC to being able to present here. I'm the social scientific one to start with, so I try to sensitize you at first that I usually have a different take on crisis and risk assessment. Relating to what Marian was presenting, I'm interested in food chains, but more in terms of researching supply chains, for instance, and I analyzed the Fukushima nuclear power plant breakdown, how it affected certain electronics, automotive industries and others, or I'm interested in how SWAT teams, for instance, or fire and emergencies deal with crises. So I have a different take, but in a second I'll zoom down into what the topic already suggests, i.e. the E. coli outbreak in Germany, which I studied as one example in this broader interest of dealing or understanding how organizations, especially when they collaborate, that's my key point, which I want to sensitize you for, that it's not only about when you deal with risks and uncertainties, it's not only reflecting upon how to optimize your methods or your organizations, but that collaborating across organizations is decisive to, in terms of when it comes to dealing with uncertainty, like this EHIC outbreak. Now, to start with, it's rather commonplace and not really surprising that each and every crisis is distinct to a certain extent, but nonetheless, there are several, let's say, common causes you can identify. And to start with, or I will relate my examples to the current refugee crisis in Germany, you can see certain underlying causes which occur across cases, be it a medical disease-related outbreak, be it or another kind of crisis. So first of all, you have a certain kind of lack of preparedness. Organizations usually fail to prepare for crisis because they don't see it as being necessary for their daily operations, or they are caught up in daily operations already to such an extent that it's really not worth pressing for being prepared. Then you have certain, as it is labeled in my discipline, organizational cultural anomalies, i.e. you might have certain ways of dealing, certain routines that you follow suit, but which might, in the case of crisis, become difficult. So think about, for instance, the Columbia space shuttle disaster, where groupthink and other mechanisms were putting pressure upon those deciding whether to launch the rocket or not, and unfortunately they felt that they need to comply with the group pressure, and that's how the disaster evolved. Then there's a lack of knowledge transfer, more or less surprisingly, across incidents. You don't seem to really learn across incidents that previous research and my own has shown. What is more oftentimes relating to my own profession, you're following the wrong business mantras. So for instance, only putting emphasis upon efficiency oriented indicators, which proved, among others, in the Fukushima crisis to be a severe catch for those organizations that rely only upon suppliers or sub-suppliers from Japan, because suddenly the whole supply chain broke down, so there was a clump effect. And last but not least, and once again, this is the overarching issue I want to sensitize you for, organizations usually tend to be aware, not aware or ignorant of the interdependencies they have to, or they might want to consider. That's my point. Now, as for the EHIC outbreak, Fleming also related to it. It was causing havoc across not only northern Germany, where it primarily struck, with 53 fatalities in total, but it caused also political havoc all over Europe due to certain failures that were made, although in total, I must say, from a managerial stance at least, it was comparatively well managed, taken all together. And afterwards, I'll try to sketch some lessons learned. But now let's zoom into the outbreak. What were the starting points or the mechanisms that were hindering collaboration or that were making the situation difficult. First of all, you had, which is a German-specific case, but could be generalized, I guess, the situation that due to being a zoonotic incident, it was the work was or needed to be divided between the veterinary department on the one hand and the other federal ministry, i.e. the public health ministry. And due to historical reasons, because prior to a couple of years ago, it was more or less one big bureaucratic institution which was split up due to political pressures. Relations across the federal ministries were cut, and this proved to be difficult when collaboration was needed. Second, of course, being in Germany, you are very you are very ordered, and you love your administrative structures, and you follow the rules. So this is not also the best thing to do when a crisis strikes. So this was a further hindrance. And last but not least, the uncertainty that surrounded the outbreak, starting from the question of what actually caused or what was the vehicle that transmitted the disease. So it wasn't in the end the sterile food, the seeds, but there was also uncertainty surrounding the exact source of contamination, so the specific strain Fleming was introducing in his presentation, but there were also other uncertainties like the role of the media, pushing it as media usually does, media representatives usually do, so that they heightened the uncertainty by trying to increase their turnover of the papers. And now let's take a look at what worked well or why we think in our studies it worked well or what helped to overcome the difficult situation. First of all, you had a common frame of reference because the pressure, the spotlight was on the actors to do something, basically. So the patients were dying. It was vividly illustrated in the tabloids. So immediately, of course, the key politicians brought it to the attention and needed to act. And this opened up what's shown here as a second point, some room for maneuvering. And this was decisive. And I still remember one chief nephrologist of of one of the largest northern German hospitals. When I was talking to him, and I also did participant observation at that time during the outbreak, he said, well, you know, I grew up in the former DDR, in the German Democratic Republic, and you always had to find ways to trick the system. And this is now my time to capitalize upon my skills because I now know what to do since I'm a bit more freed, and I can really work freely. And interestingly, this leeway enabled certain, that's what's labeled here, actors' gains, set free some motivations, which fostered overcoming the crisis because people suddenly realized, well, I can gain my increase my academic reputation by publishing really cool data. I can gain new money, get new funds immediately from funding institutions, which is oftentimes tremendously difficult. And so they really saw incentives there. Then what we found also out, and which was, I think, working quite well, was that they used, let's say, basic managerial ideas. That's what's labeled here, modifying past experiences, where a former medical doctor at the army who was serving in Afghanistan said, okay, let's build up a modular structure across institutions, since we have in Germany a federal system, which makes things oftentimes quite difficult to handle. He said, let's introduce this so-called EAC task force as a cross-cutting project, and have modular expertise from each and every institution necessary to solve the crisis. And this worked quite well. And relating to the infrastructures mentioned here in the last point, it was also visible that existing structures for different purposes were in a well-modified fashion used to solve the crisis. So for instance, the German Nephrological Society had a newsletter, more or less for marketing or informative purposes, but turned it into a database where critical information was collected to help to spread information about the latest ways how to solve or how to what the most recent test results were in the course of the crisis. And so it was a very good mechanism to spread the knowledge gained during the crisis so as to solve the crisis. And then last but not least, as one thing I would like to point out, which turned out to be, despite the usual mantra these days that you ought to be transparent, so think of Wikipedia or open access databases, etc. So transparency is oftentimes king, but in this case, as has been documented quite well, I think, being transparent and communicating each and every intermediate step or result of how you handle the crisis might have detrimental effects. So arguing it were the cucumbers, the lettuce, tomatoes, and finally the sprouts didn't really help to foster trust in the to build up trust in the institutions and to solve the crisis. It was rather confusing, and in the end, the tabloids said, shall we believe you that it are by now the sprouts, or isn't it maybe something else? So this might be something also worth considering. Now, what can be learned from this specific incident, but also in more general terms, but I'm relating here only to the German situation. So it could be generalized. First of all, I'd like to focus upon intra-organizational implications. So what can a single organization do before I turn to lessons learned in terms of what can be learned for collaboration across organizations, institutions. So first of all, in terms of the intra-organizational implications, as mentioned before, that's why I start with it, in terms of the communication, be aware what to communicate and when to communicate. It's easier said than done, but since we had this problem with the, or in this case at least, the problem with the federal system, a lot of people were eager to air first that they have the result, what the actual source of contamination is, to gain some fame maybe, but obviously when you have announced the wrong source of contamination, i.e. for instance cucumbers, as the Hamburg senator did, it has severe legal ramifications also and financial ramifications afterwards. So be careful about this aspect of communicating and transparency. Then learning from and across incidents is critical, so try to reflect what worked, what didn't work well. It's easier said than done, or it seems obvious, but only minor changes, as also a report by the Court of Justice has documented. It's hardly changes have been made after ECIT has been improved in the German setting, but this is a key point from our perspective, or the research I've been doing. And then also consider redundancies to be beneficial, that you have ties across organizations or perhaps boundary spanning personnel that work at the intersection of different institutions so as to enable knowledge flow to other organizations. And last but not least, as a very practical advice, relating now again to another, or giving you another example of another head of department at another, in this case at a clinic in Hamburg, he said, well, during the crisis is the best time to make changes. And I think this is a simple message, but worth paying attention to, because during the crisis you have the leeway, you have the political commitment, and also other organizations exploited this idea. So think, for instance, about the US American drug company Alexion, who passed several trial stages, which usually takes much longer, but due to the severe situation the public health authorities were facing, they eased the process and sped it up so as to allow it being tested at the respective patients suffering from EHEC or the HUS syndrome. Now, as for the intra-organizational lessons, as mentioned, it's, from my perspective, important to perceive yourself not being alone, but being interconnected with other organizations and people in other organizations. And be aware that not everyone is pulling into the same direction. So, of course, at first sight, you might think, well, if there's a crisis, everyone needs to pull into the same direction. But at a closer glance, there's always some kind of war for meaning. So for instance, NGOs try to capitalize upon such crisis in order to gain financial support. Political parties obviously clash in these cases usually. So be aware that it's quite a dangerous terrain, if you like, and hence, linking back to the communication issue, you might want to take care of whether or not, or to what extent you are communicating transparently what's going on and what the intermediate results are. As for a second aspect, similar to the ordinary business arena, of course, if you get in external experts, you can benefit from the expertise and legitimize your actions more appropriately. And last but not least, more or less as a call to all of you, and I was happy to see that there are in Marion's presentation and Fleming's presentations also indications of that working across levels of, as mentioned here, national level, European level, and maybe also with the WHO on a global level, you might want to perceive how knowledge transfer is eased, how crises are more effectively handled in such a networked constellations. Although, as a final word, not each and every type of network or networks per se are also not the solution per se, because you have communication costs, coordination costs, you might have micro-political differences where people compete against each other on the different levels, but also across levels. So it's not that just by installing some kind of network where you try to engage in some kind of communication flow or information flow, you solve each and every problem, but at least as has been shown by the EHEC outbreak, where suddenly collaboration emerged across institutions, be it the EHEC task force or other also more informal initiatives, it was quite beneficial. That's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Gordon, for that very insightful review of organisational and social aspects of risk analysis in a crisis situation. Have we any questions?
Thank you. You mentioned the uncertainty in the identifying the source of the outbreak, and I'd like to zoom in on that a little bit more, because when you go to epidemiology classes, the first lesson you learn is that a statistical association is not evidence for causation, and in the foodborne outbreak, the main that translates to you also want to isolate the same pathogen, preferably now with a high degree of genetic similarity from the patient and the food. But at the least that takes a lot more time, and very often you don't achieve that holy grail like in the German outbreak. The pathogen has never been isolated from the food. So in terms of communicating the evidence, there's a very long period where you don't have the complete evidence, but then maybe you need to communicate. And you said it's something to take into account, but can you be a bit more specific from your background how to deal with that major uncertainty in foodborne outbreaks?
First of all, since I'm not from the medical side, I would never dare to answer it in this regard. Let's put it this way, in this, for me, technical medical arena. From a, let's say, communicative stance, I would, and this didn't happen, and I think now it's improving, also with having a new president at the Robert Koch Institute, reflect upon, in terms of lines of communication, who's communicating what at what point in time. And I'm fully aware that you still have some kind of uncertainty even after it's officially approved or whatever across its different stages, if I interpreted your introductory sentence correctly. But nonetheless, I think across institutions you could have, at least for the German setting with the federal system, you could have been being more reflexive about who is in charge of airing what kind of information. The catch was that there was the incentive to come up with the information first, because you wanted to be the hero that announced at first it is this or that source of contamination, so that you can be in a favorable light in front of your voters, for instance, because you have protected them, because it are the cucumbers or it are the tomatoes. But on the other hand, then the game blame starts when you're wrong. And to deal with this, let's say, mechanism, with this blame game, I think it would have been beneficial if there was a clear line of responsibility in terms of the communication towards the press, for instance, across organizations.
Thank you. One more question at the back.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm from the Spanish Food Safety and Nutrition Agency, and I'm not quite sure if I understood, because the message I got is that communication and transparency is bad. When the outbreak got out of the open, I think Germany was up on the peak of the outbreak. I would differentiate what it is, transparency or communicating to media and politicians' declaration, to what is cooperation between member states. The rapid alert system, who actually carry the cucumber and the tomatoes, well, mainly the cucumber problem, is a system that is secret, is not out of the open. I think the problem with the outbreak was the politicians and media to cover, but I really think that if the outbreak would have been more collaborative, the German authorities right from the beginning, it wouldn't been much helpful. So I don't know, I think we should differentiate what it is media and politician to what it is member state cooperation, which I think is very important.
Okay, thank you for this clarification. I fully agree with you. Sorry if I didn't bring my point across adequately. I would also say that it worked on the scientific arena, so they had conference calls from ECDC, involving ECDC, the Robert Koch Institute, and accompanying or related institutions throughout Europe. But this intersection between science and the political arena / the media, I think that's worth improving.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you very much. In food crisis, management has become really a hot issue. What you think? How you think that, considering time and media and the concern of the majority of population in cases of food crisis, what you suggest? How plans to be ready, managers taking care of, and sometimes they are not making the right decision because the pressure of the media and the time.
Yes, sorry, and what shall I answer?
What,
I agree with the observation.
Yeah, managers, what to do during food crisis?
In terms of the managers or whom?
The manager himself.
As I tried to point out, I would suggest that you reflect upon how to collaborate across institutions, because there is some kind of red race for glory. There is some kind of benefit, to frame it more positively, when you ease the knowledge flow across institutions. And of course it's aggravated on a European level, as you pointed out, although it worked certainly better than, or could have been working better. But there's always room for improvement, I would suggest, because within the German system, where I had the best insights, there, like this EAC task force was, to relate to that issue again, quite helpful to link the knowledge flow across institutions, coordinate activities, and avoid a situation or improves the situation. I don't say that it's the solution per se, once again, so being more networked and increasing the knowledge flow across institutions also has some kind of downsides, which I didn't have the time to go into detail, but I think this would be the most hands-on advice to reflect upon in advance prior to the next crisis, whom to relate to and how to engage, regardless of the specific strain of disease or the specific kind of disease outbreak.
Thank you. Well, we must end this session now, so thanks very much, Gordon, for that presentation. Thank you. And I'll just hand the mic back to Birgit, who will organise our panel discussion for the next 30 minutes.